So today we continue in our series called Breaking Busy, and we have been talking about how difficult it is in a busy world to find peace and freedom from anxiety. We often function so far over our capacity that we end up exhausted and worn out. And so we've talked throughout this series about lots of different ways to find freedom from the busyness of our lives. And this week's chapter is called Time, and it's got some great tips in the book from time management. But as I thought about all of these things, I wanted to talk not just about time management, but about something even more important, something that the Bible talks a lot about, and that is Sabbath. And so today we're going to take a Sabbath from Breaking Busy, and we're going to look at this concept of Sabbath. It works out well because it's the 7th week of our series, so that was handy. Sabbath is a gift that helps us escape the tyranny of the urgent and the constant demands from our society. Sabbath gives us the freedom to learn about God and to find our place in God's family. Sabbath gives us the freedom to breathe in the midst of anxiety. And so as we dive into this topic of practicing the Sabbath, I wanted to remind you of how our Bible begins. And it begins this way. You probably know it well. In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was a dark and formless void, and God's Spirit hovered over the waters. And then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw the light and said that it was good. That's right. It was good. And then God separated the waters and created the sky above and the waters below. And there was evening and there was morning. This is the other pattern that follows all the way through. There was evening and there was morning, and that was the second day. So now we've had 2 days. The third day, God created dry land and vegetation, and God looked out at all of these things that were created, and God said that it was indeed good. And then God said, "Let there be lights in the dome of the sky," and God created the stars and the moon and the sun, and God looked at all of the things that were there, and God said it was. And then God said, "Let the waters bring forth all of the living creatures and the birds fly across the dome of the sky." And God looked at all of it and said that it was. And then God said, "Let the earth bring forth living creatures of every kind." And so all of the mammals and the reptiles and all of these things were created. And then the humans were created. God said, "Let us make humankind in our image." And it was so. And God saw everything that he had made, and indeed it was very good. Yeah, see, that was tricky. It was very good when he looked at everything that he had created. And then on the 7th day, God finished all of the work, and he rested on the 7th day for all of the work that he had done. God blessed the 7th day and called it holy. Indeed, it wasn't just good. It was better than good. The Sabbath, that rest, was so delicious, is the word that Barbara Brown Taylor uses for it. It was so good that God said, "This day is holy." And it was set apart for something sacred. And God didn't just say, "I will practice all of this holiness." God said that we together should participate in this rest because it was so beautiful and blessed and should be holy. So we are called not just to pay attention to what God did, but to practice it as well. Now, before I say any more about what the Sabbath is, I also want to spend a few moments with you on what the Sabbath is not. Now, I grew up going to church, and I learned all of the 10 Commandments in confirmation class. And of course, I learned, as Carrie told the children, that one of the commandments, it's right there in the middle, is honor the Sabbath day and keep it holy. But I was pretty sure, as I looked around at the way that adults practiced their faith, I was pretty sure that keeping the Sabbath holy was a little bit like celebrating the Passover every year or offering sacrifices to the temple. You know, it was something that was really good and really important, like way, way back then, right? And it was not something that we in our modern world had to celebrate anymore. And after all, you know, Jesus was a bit critical of people who over celebrated the Sabbath and paid extra attention to the rules. So Jesus, you know, criticized the Sabbath, and I thought, well, that must mean that we were free from that. Now, I'm aware that not everybody has always been free from celebrating the Sabbath. Barbara Brown Taylor, who wrote a book called An Altar in the World, said that if you are of a certain age and you were raised in the South, then for all practical purposes, the commandment might as well have read, remember the Sabbath day and keep it boring. She said, and I don't know that you have to grow up in the South to have experienced this, but that for her, in her childhood, they practiced Sabbath and Sabbath keeping, but it meant you must sit on the porch with all of your older relatives, and you must not run, you must not play cards, you must not play any fun games, you must not scream or shout or celebrate in any way that would violate the Sabbath. And it wasn't very fun. It wasn't very enjoyable. There was no joy and refreshment in the Sabbath, or maybe there was for the adults, but it certainly wasn't so for the kids. And so she didn't grow up with a love of Sabbath. Now, as I've come to understand Sabbath, it isn't simply about sitting still and being bored in the parlor. It is about saying no, and saying no to our work, and saying no to all the things that we feel, all the pressures that we have upon us. But it's not just about sitting still and being miserable. It's about spending time allowing God to refresh your soul. You see, our culture over and over and over says that in order to accomplish something great, you have to do lots of things. In order to be great, you have to be a doer. But Sabbath says that if we stop, if we say no, if we remind ourselves of who God is, in our nothingness, we are great, not because of what we've done, but because of who God is. Sabbath then becomes the ultimate cure for works righteousness. It's not about what we have to do to get to God. Sabbath is about reminding ourselves that God is already good enough. Wayne Muller, who wrote a book about the Sabbath, writes this: our culture supposes that action and accomplishment are better than rest, that doing something, anything, is better than doing nothing. Because of our desire to succeed and meet our ever-growing expectations, we do not rest. And because we do not rest, we lose our way. You see, at its heart, Sabbath keeping is really about helping all of us to break busy. It's interesting to me that in Psalm 23, God says he makes me lie down in green pastures. Did you hear that? Sometimes we have to be made to lie down in green pastures. David says that God, our good shepherd, had to force him to do that. I heard once that if sheep were left to graze on their own, that they would eat and eat and eat until their stomach burst. And we as humans, I think, if left to our own devices, do something very similar. We work and work and work and work until we collapse exhausted. Or possibly we eat and eat and eat until we can't eat anymore. But God has to make us lie down. And that's the point of this command that we find. Marjorie Thompson, in her book Soul Feast, says, it is significant that the Bible likens us to sheep and not to cattle. Because you see, in Scripture, sheep are not driven, but they are led. Cattle are driven. We have to drive cattle, but sheep are led by their good shepherd, and that's what we are supposed to be, not driven by our busyness, but led by our good God. So if Sabbath is not sitting still in the parlor and crocheting doilies all day, and if Sabbath is important to practice, then how do we practice Sabbath rightly? So for this, I want to go back to my college days. In college, I attended this Christian fellowship group, and one week we had a speaker come and talk to us about Sabbath. And when he said, and I don't remember it exactly, but mostly what I remember is that he talked about how important it was to spend time with God. And then he said, you can do this by doing a modified Jewish Sabbath. And what he meant was that the Jewish Sabbath starts on Friday night, right? So for the Jewish people, Sabbath means 7, so they celebrate it on Saturday, the 7th day. And so they would... So he said, but they begin at night. Remember back to the 10 Commandments, there was evening and there was morning, the first day or the second day or the 7th day. So the Jewish Sabbath begins in the evening. And so he said, start your Sabbath on Saturday night. And I thought, well, I already don't do homework then. That's perfect. and then he said, you can go to church and you can take a nap, and then you can call your family or do whatever, and then you can get back to whatever you need to do at 5 o'clock on Sunday night. And so I started to practice it, and I'll tell you, it really wasn't all that much different than what I was already doing, right? Nobody does homework on Sunday morning. Nobody does homework on Sunday afternoon or Saturday night. But in saying that I was practicing Sabbath and thinking about it that way, I reoriented my whole attitude toward what Sabbath meant. I no longer felt guilty for not getting homework done on Sunday afternoon. I allowed myself this luxurious couple hours after lunch to take a nap or to take a walk or to do something good for myself, to read a fun book, which often led to taking a nap. And then I would call my parents, which they were grateful for, and then I didn't have to feel guilty about how I had never called my parents all week long. And it was really good. The whole thing was really good. Now, I will confess to you that keeping Sabbath has become harder as I got older. I still draw a line in the sand and I say, no dishes shall be done on Sunday, which means that Monday I have to do a lot of extra work. But I don't do laundry and I don't do the dishes on Sunday afternoon. We eat leftovers and popcorn for our Sunday meals, because that is my way of saying that this is my Sabbath. But it turns out that when you have children, you can't really tell a 6-month-old, shh, I'm having my Sabbath. You need to go play by yourself. So I had to learn. My kids are older now, but still they don't quite get this idea of Sabbath. And so I had to learn different ways of practicing it. That sometimes practicing Sabbath means just spending intentional time with your children and enjoying who they are and allowing them to be a blessing. And I'll tell you that while I struggle with Sabbath, that every time that I do go off on my own for a walk in the woods, or when I intentionally say, I'm not going to do all of those other chores or think about work, I will play Guess Who with you for the next 3 hours. It's awesome. Well, maybe not for 3 hours, but it's really good, right? It's good to spend those intentional moments with our family. A blessing every time. And as you do these, it's not just about taking a vacation. It's about saying to God before and after, thank you for this moment in which I can refresh my soul. So years later, I learned more about this idea of celebrating Sabbath beginning in the evening. And I'm not saying that's the only way to practice it, but I wanted you to hear these two different thoughts about this. Marjorie Thompson, in her book Soul Feast, again, says this. She says, the first third of your day, when you practice Sabbath this way, the first third of your day is spent in sleep, trusting that God is at work through the night without your conscious participation. You then rise and join in God's labors with energy and rest and insight from your dreams. So you see, Sabbath is about doing nothing first and allowing God to restore your soul. You spend time in sleep at first, allowing God to restore you during that time. Eugene Peterson adds to this idea by writing that the Hebrew sequence of evening and morning condition us to rhythms of grace. He said, we go to sleep and God begins his work, and we wake and we are called out to participate in God's creative action. But grace comes first. Grace is primary. We wake into a world we did not make, and we wake into a salvation that we did not earn. Isn't that beautiful? That we, as we rest and we sleep first, that we experience God's grace. Additionally, other scholars have pointed out how powerful it is that the Christians started practicing Sabbath on the first day of the week instead of the last day of the week. That by doing it the first day of the week, we say, before we've done any work this week, before we've done anything at all, we consciously choose to put God first in this holy day of rest. And then all of our work, we believe, will be better because of that intentional time that we invested in God. So it's good. It's good to trust God first. It's good to participate in the Sabbath. But it's hard to trust, isn't it? Hard to let go of all those things. I thought about when you ask, if you encounter any elementary school age kid, and you ask them, what is your favorite part of the day? Do you know what they say without a doubt? They say recess! And I think, when did we as adults forget that recess was the best part of our week, right? That's what Sabbath ought to be. It's spending time with your friends. It's playing. It's enjoying God's creation. We forgot to enjoy recess. I think we got too many responsibilities piled in our lives. Having a day off seems nice, but we can't figure out how to juggle and balance all of our other responsibilities. And so we need a break. Marjorie Thompson tells this story that's kind of funny, I think, of a man named George Singer. Now, George was a civic leader, and he was involved in all sorts of good works. He was one of these people that's always talking on his phone, and he's always busy, and he's always doing really, really good things all the time. But he begins to feel himself getting sick, like really sick, mono kind of sick. And he starts thinking, I don't have time to be sick. I don't have time to lay in bed and waste an entire week while I get better. And he's so angry about it, and he goes to sleep angry, and then he has this dream. And he imagines God pacing back and forth, saying, oh no, George Singer is about to get sick. I don't know what I'm going to do. Can you imagine God doing that? I'm going to tell you, God does not do that. God is not worried about you getting sick and running out of the possibility that God might be able to do what needs to be done. If we believe that God can do immeasurably more than we could ever ask or imagine, then how can we possibly think that God's purposes will be thwarted by us taking a few hours off? And those few hours reorient our whole lives so that we remember who God is and what God can do and whom we are in God's whole plan and kingdom. We can rest, and we need to rest because that's how we were designed. And when we are able to rest and say thank you to God for who God is, we become the people that God created us to be. In Sabbath, we have remembered who God is and what God can do. So we need to begin. If you can only begin with 10 minutes by locking yourself in the bathroom and you take a little extra time to pray, then that's where you start. Start there. Maybe you begin by going for a walk when you think you might not have time for it. Or maybe you decide, yes, today I'm not going to say I'm too busy to my children or grandchildren, and I'm going to stop and play that game with them. Maybe it's when you're at the soccer field and you're watching the kids warm up. You can't go away, but you take a mental break and you say, I'm going to spend the next 10 minutes listing off things that I am grateful for. You can practice Sabbath keeping. I don't know how it'll work in your life. I don't know what your responsibilities are, but I believe that you can, and I believe that when you do, it will bring unbelievable blessing to you. God is longing to bring you peace and refreshment. So take time for Sabbath and allow God to bring rest to your weary soul. Amen. Let's